안녕하세요. 오늘 날씨 정말 좋네요. 꼭 새로운 걸 배우고 싶어지는 그런 날씨랄까요?
맞아요. 특히 오늘은 저희가 또 흥미로운 자료를 살펴볼 거라 저도 기대가 됩니다.
네, 지난주에 열렸던 비트코인 서울 2025 컨퍼런스, 열기가 정말 대단했죠.
네, 정말 뜨거웠습니다. 그 현장 분위기가 아직도 생생한데요.
그래서 오늘은 그 컨퍼런스의 핵심 세션 중 하나, 바로 한국 금융시장과 비트코인 현물 ETF 도입 관련 패널 토론 내용을 좀 집중적으로 살펴보려고 합니다.
그거 정말 중요한 세션이었죠. 관심들이 엄청났어요.
그렇죠. 혹시 컨퍼런스에 참석하지 못하셨거나 아니면 현장의 열기를 다시 한번 느끼고 싶은 분들께 딱 좋은 시간이 될 것 같습니다.
네, 그리고 혹시 그 세션 리포트, 그러니까 패널 토론 녹취록 같은 걸 가지고 계시다면요. 그걸 먼저 한번 읽어보시고 들으시면 오늘 저희 얘기가 훨씬 더 깊게 와닿으실 거예요.
좋은 팁이네요. 자, 그럼 한국 금융계와 블록체인 업계 리더들은 과연 이 비트코인 ETF에 대해 어떤 생각들을 나눴을까요? 한번 자세히 들여다보죠.
네, 이 세션에는 금융투자협회의 서유석 회장님, 그리고 해시드의 김소준 대표님, 이렇게 두 분이 참여하셨고 사회는 고란 기자님이 보셨습니다.
시작부터 두 분 다 한국의 현재 상황에 대한 좀 걱정, 우려 이런 걸 표현하셨어요.
맞아요. 서 회장님은 한국이 이 디지털 자산 접근성 면에서 좀 뒤처져서 뭐랄까 갈라파고스가 될 수도 있다. 이런 걱정을 하셨고요.
갈라파고스요? 고립된다는 의미겠죠?
그렇죠. 그리고 김 대표님은 한국 규제가 너무 선진국 따라가는 데만 급급해서 혁신을 주도하기 어렵다는 점을 지적했죠.
특히 신기술에 대해서는 좀 더 선제적인 규제 완화가 필요하다 이런 말씀이셨던 것 같아요.
네, 맞습니다. 혁신을 하려고 해도 뭔가 규제가 발목을 잡는 듯한 느낌이다. 그런 뉘앙스였죠.
두 분이 비트코인을 보는 시각도 약간 달라서 흥미로웠어요. 서 회장님은 비트코인과 그 기반 기술인 블록체인, 이게 전통 금융 인프라를 혁신할 어떤 초석이 될 수 있다 이렇게 보셨고요.
반면에 김 대표님은 비트코인을 회사나 특정 리더가 없이 커뮤니티 중심으로 돌아가는 프로토콜 경제의 대표적인 사례로 설명을 했어요.
프로토콜 경제요? 그게 정확히 어떤 개념일까요?
네. 그러니까 정해진 규칙, 즉 프로토콜에 따라서 참여자들이 서로 상호작용하고 또 투명한 인센티브 구조를 통해서 보상을 받는 그런 시스템을 말하는 거죠. 그래서 자발적으로 생태계에 기여하는 사람들이 생긴다는 거예요.
이해가 되네요. 자, 그럼 이제 가장 많은 분들이 궁금해하실 ETF 이야기로 넘어가 볼까요? 미국에서는 비트코인 현물 ETF가 정말 엄청난 성공을 거뒀잖아요.
네, 그렇죠.
사 회장님은 그 성공 요인으로 크게 세 가지를 꼽으셨어요. 첫째는 투자자 보호 장치가 잘 되어 있다는 거, 둘째는 주식처럼 거래하기가 편리하다는 거.
그리고 마지막으로는 기존 자산, 주식이나 채권 같은 것들과 상관관계가 낮아서 포트포리오 분산 효과가 크다는 점을 드셨죠.
네. 근데 이렇게 미국에서는 잘 나가는데 왜 한국은 아직 소식이 없을까요?
그게 참 문제인데 서 회장님 지적대로 과거에 있었던 좀 투기 광풍 이런 것 때문에 형성된 부정적인 인식도 있고 규제 당국이 상당히 보수적인 태도를 취하고 있다는 거죠.
아무래도 좀 조심스러울 수밖에 없겠네요.
네. 그리고 또 현실적인 문제가 현행 자본시장법상 ETF 기초자산 목록에 비트코인이 명확하게 포함되어 있지 않다는 거예요. 법적인 근거가 아직 미비한 거죠.
법적인 문제군요. 그럼 결국 법을 개정하거나 아니면 금융당국이 좀 전향적으로 유권 해석을 내려줘야 한다는 거네요.
그렇죠. 그게 필요한 상황입니다. 쉽지는 않겠지만요.
정말 만약에 ETF가 도입된다면 어떤 효과가 있을까요? 김 대표님은 어떻게 전망하셨죠?
김 대표님은 일단 기관 투자자들의 접근성이 확 높아질 거라고 봤어요. 그러면 자연스럽게 시장 전체 파이가 커질 거고 더 나아가서 기업들이 비트코인을 재무대표상의 자산으로 포함시키는 사례도 늘어날 수 있다고 전망했습니다.
기업 자산으로요? 흥미롭네요. 그럼 국내 운용사들은 이런 상황에 대비해서 준비를 하고 있을까요?
네, 서 회장님 말씀으로는 주요 운용사들은 이미 상품 출시 준비에 들어갔다고 하고요. 다만 이걸 운용하려면 자산을 안전하게 보관하고 관리해줄 수탁사나 또 거래를 원활하게 지원하는 프라임 브로커 같은 협력 파트너들이 필요하다고 강조하셨어요. 생태계 조성이 중요하다는 거죠.
그렇군요. 김 대표님 생각은 어떠셨어요? 국내 운용사들의 경쟁력에 대해서요.
김 대표님은 국내 운용사들의 상품 설계 능력 자체는 충분하다고 봤어요. 오히려 한국 투자자 입장에서는 편의성이나 세금 처리 문제, 또 한국어 정보 제공, 분쟁 해결 같은 부분에서 미국 ETF보다 더 나을 수 있다. 경쟁력이 충분하다. 이렇게 자신감을 보이셨죠.
듣고 보니 그러네요. 서 회장님도 비슷한 맥락에서 예를 들어 환율 변동 위험을 없앤 환해지 상품이라든지 아니면 비트코인이란 다른 자산을 결합한 좀 창의적인 상품 출시 가능성 이런 걸 언급하면서 한국 운용사만의 강점이 있을 거라고 말씀하셨고요.
네. 그리고 더 나아가서 서 회장님은 좀 더 장기적인 그림을 그리셨는데 앞으로는 주식, 채권, 부동산 펀드 같은 것들이 전부 다 토큰 형태로 발행되는 토큰 증권, 즉 STO 시대가 올 거라고 전망하셨어요.
토큰 증권 시대요? 와.
네. 이게 단순히 비용 절감이나 효율화뿐만 아니라 예를 들면 야구장 건사라는 토큰을 발행해서 그 토큰을 가진 팬들한테 특별한 혜택을 준다거나 하는 식의 다양한 부가 서비스를 결합할 수 있게 된다는 거죠.
와, 정말 금융의 모습이 확 바뀔 수도 있겠는데요.
그렇죠. 상상력이 좀 필요한 부분이죠.
마지막으로 모두가 솔깃할 만한 가격 예측도 있었죠.
네, 있었습니다. 김 대표님이 상당히 조심스럽게 올해 안에 비트코인 가격이 20만 달러, 우리 돈으로 한 2억 7천만 원 정도? 그 정도까지 도달할 가능성도 있지 않겠냐 이렇게 언급을 하셨어요. 물론 투자를 권유하는 건 절대 아니라고 선을 그으셨지만요.
20만 달러요? 와우. 서 회장님은 어떠셨나요?
서 회장님은 구체적인 숫자를 예측하기보다는 비트코인이 가진 디지털 금으로서의 가치에 좀 더 주목해야 한다 이런 입장이셨고 본인도 투자를 한번 고려해보겠다 이렇게 좀 위트 있게 답변하셨죠.
하하, 재밌네요. 저는 이번 토론을 쭉 보면서 한국 금융시장이 정말 규제와 혁신 사이에서 되게 중요한 기로에 서 있구나. 이걸 다시 한번 느꼈습니다.
맞아요.
ETF 도입이라는 게 그냥 상품 하나 더 추가하는 그런 문제가 아니라 앞으로 글로벌 디지털 자산 시장에서 한국이 어떤 위치를 차지하게 될 거냐 하는 문제랑 직결된 것 같아요.
네, 저도 전적으로 동감합니다. 단순히 기술적인 문제, 법적인 문제를 넘어서서 결국 우리가 이 미래 금융 환경 변화에 얼마나 적극적으로 또 능동적으로 대처할 준비가 되어 있는가 이걸 묻는 근본적인 질문이라는 생각이 들었어요.
특히 두 분 전문가 모두 한국 시장의 잠재력은 인정하면서도 동시에 자칫하면 뒤처질 수 있다는 위기의식을 공유하고 있다는 점이 굉장히 인상 깊었습니다.
맞습니다. 기회와 위기가 공존하는 상황인 거죠.
네, 앞으로의 비트코인 ETF 도입 논의가 어떻게 흘러갈지 정말 계속 지켜봐야 할 것 같습니다. 오늘 저희 이야기가 이 복잡한 주제를 이해하시는데 조금이나마 도움이 되었으면 좋겠네요.
마지막으로 청취자 여러분께 한번 여쭤보고 싶어요. 여러분은 한국의 비트코인 ETF 도입에 대해서 어떻게 생각하시나요? 만약 도입이 된다면 여러분의 투자 환경에는 어떤 변화가 생길 거라고 기대하시는지요? 한 번쯤 생각해 보시면 어떨까 싶습니다.
그럼 저희는 다음 시간에 더 흥미로운 내용으로 다시 찾아뵙겠습니다. 들어주셔서 감사합니다.
감사합니다.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're doing something a bit special. We're taking you back, revisiting one of the standout sessions from Bitcoin Seoul 2025.
Yeah, it really generated a lot of buzz.
Exactly. So if you couldn't make it to the conference, or maybe you were there but just want to, refresh your memory on the key discussions and insights, well, this deep dive is definitely for you. Our mission today is pretty clear. We're going to pull out the most crucial bits of knowledge from what was, honestly, a really fascinating panel discussion.
Absolutely. We're zeroing in on that specific talk, the one titled Bitcoin ETF, Necessity and Challenges in Korea. And it really brought together some heavy hitters.
Oh, for sure.
You had the chairman of the Korea Financial Investment Association, a real leader from traditional finance, and then right alongside him, the CEO of Hashed, a major pioneer in the Web3 space.
A great mix of perspectives.
Totally. And it was all moderated very skillfully by a seasoned financial journalist.
So yeah, get comfortable. We're about to unpack the most important insights on where things stand right now with Bitcoin ETFs in Korea and where they might be heading. We'll look at it from both angles, that traditional finance view and the cutting-edge blockchain innovation perspective.
Sounds good.
Okay, let's get into it. The conversation at Bitcoin Seoul 2025, it sounds like it kicked off almost immediately with this real sense of urgency about Korea's position, globally speaking, in digital assets, like a genuine concern. What were the main worries the panelists were voicing?
Well, the chairman of the Korea Financial Investment Association, Seoul2025, he really laid out the traditional finance perspective, and it was quite direct. He expressed the significant worry about Korea potentially becoming a Galapagos.
Galapagos,
Like-
like the islands.
Exactly, drawing that parallel, to those isolated islands where species evolved differently.
Mhm.
The idea is that Korea risks developing its own kind of separate, maybe even outdated digital asset system if it keeps diverging from global trends in regulation and markets.
Oh, okay. Isolated.
Right. And he's apparently been saying this for a while, really pushing for the quick introduction of Bitcoin ETFs here. His big concern is that if Korea doesn't move faster, it just falls further and further behind what's happening globally.
That Galapagos analogy really sticks with you. It paints quite a picture. And was this feeling shared? I mean, did the Web3 side, Kim Seo-jeon from Hachette, did he echo that concern?
Oh, absolutely. Kim Seo-jeon, he was right there with him. He completely agreed that Korea is, well, significantly behind when it comes to setting up the right regulatory frameworks and institutional structures for virtual assets.
So it's a shared frustration then.
Definitely. He pointed out this pattern in how Korea often handles regulation. Authorities tend to sort of wait and see what other big players like the US or Japan do first before Korea makes its move.
Like waiting for a benchmark.
Precisely. And he argued, this isn't just about being cautious. It's kind of an ingrained approach here, especially with new tech. They wait for others to set the standard. But the downside, the real insight he offered, is that while it might feel safer, it inevitably stifles homegrown innovation.
This is critical for Korea.
Exactly. For a country that relies so much on, human creativity and being quick adopters, not on natural resources, that kind of regulatory lag is really frustrating. You could tell he felt strongly about it.
Okay, so you have these pretty serious concerns about Korea falling behind this Galapagos risk. But despite that, you mentioned there was also the sense of hope, right? What's actually driving that optimism, especially given that history of regulatory caution?
Yeah, there was a definite shift, which was encouraging to hear. A really big factor is the current government's promise, an explicit pledge, actually to allow virtual asset ETFs.
Okay, so a top-down signal.
Right. And what's maybe even more significant is that apparently all the presidential candidates in the last election, not just the winner, they all put forward positive guidelines or stances towards the virtual asset market.
Oh, interesting. So broad political agreement.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
At least a broad consensus that this area needs positive development. And that widespread political nod has created pretty strong expectations that we'll see more market-friendly changes, maybe particularly in the second half of this year.
What?
It feels like maybe, just maybe, things that have been stuck could finally start moving.
That political consensus does sound like a potential game changer. Now, before we get deeper into the ETFs themselves, it's always interesting how leaders from different fields define the core thing, in this case, Bitcoin. How did the traditional finance guy and the Web3 guy describe its fundamental nature? Did they see it the same way?
It was interesting. From the traditional finance side, Chairman CEO described Bitcoin, it's been around since 2009, as an asset that has clearly built up global value over years of research, growth, and development. Pretty standard asset view. But what he really emphasized, which maybe you wouldn't expect as much from a traditional finance figure, was the underlying blockchain technology. He sees that as the truly foundational piece, something that could radically change the whole infrastructure of traditional finance.
So not just the coin, but the tech underneath.
Exactly. For him, it's not just about a new thing to invest in. It's the bedrock for making the whole financial system potentially way more efficient, more transparent. A real transformation.
Okay, and what about the Web3 perspective from Kim Seo-jeon? I bet he focused more on the unique structure.
You bet. Kim Seo-jeon framed Bitcoin through this concept he calls the protocol economy. He highlighted its really unique features. These transparent, unchangeable incentive rules built right into the code. Development that's genuinely driven by the community with no central company calling the shots. And crucially, no traditional corporate structure, no known founder figure like Satoshi remaining involved.
So the system incentivizes itself, basically.
Right. People are motivated to contribute and maintain the network through the protocol's own rules, automatically, without needing a CEO or a board directing things. So yeah, while Chairman CEO sees a global asset built on revolutionary tech, Kim Seo-jeon sees it as sort of the prime example of a whole new economic model, one where the protocol itself drives value and innovation totally separate from any company structure. A decentralized network in its purest form.
A global asset versus a new economic paradigm. That's quite the contrast, but also complementary in a way.
Yeah.
So given that, why have Bitcoin ETFs been such a runaway success in places like the U.S.? And, why is Korea still sort of watching from the stands?
Yeah, the global success is pretty staggering. I mean, Canada was actually first technically because their regulators were a bit more flexible early on.
Right, I remember.
But the real game changer was the launch of the U.S. Bitcoin ETFs back in January of last year. The growth was just explosive. And less than a year and a half, those U.S. Bitcoin ETFs have ballooned to roughly $125 billion.
Wow, 125 billion.
Yeah, which is something like 150 to 160 trillion Korean won. It's massive. And get this, last year, they pulled in more money than any other type of ETF listed in the U.S., all categories combined.
More than S&P 500 ETFs, more than everything.
Apparently so, for that period. It just shows this huge, almost unprecedented level of investor demand.
That is incredible. It really makes you ask, though, for someone listening who thinks, well, I can just buy Bitcoin directly on an exchange, what's the big draw? Why are so many investors, especially maybe bigger ones, flocking to the ETF instead?
That's a key question. And there are really three main reasons driving that preference, especially beyond the crypto native crowd. First off, it's about investor protection.
Okay, safety first.
Exactly. When you invest through established financial institutions, the ones that offer ETFs, they operate under pretty strict regulatory oversight. There are layers of rules, compliance checks, established ways to handle disputes, consumer protections. It offers a sense of security that, frankly, buying directly from some exchanges, especially less regulated ones, might not provide. And given the history of volatility and security issues in crypto, that's a big deal for many investors.
Makes sense. What else?
Second, just plain trading convenience. ETFs trade on regular stock exchanges, just like buying shares of Apple or Samsung.
Ah, so use your existing brokerage account.
Precisely. No need to set up new accounts on crypto platforms, figure out digital wallets, worry about private keys. None of that hassle. You buy and sell it just like any other stock. Super easy.
That's a big practical advantage.
And third, and this is really important, especially for more sophisticated investors and institutions, it's portfolio diversification. Bitcoin, and by extension, Bitcoin ETFs, has shown a pretty low correlation with traditional assets, stocks, bonds, commodities.
Meaning it doesn't just move up and down with the stock market.
Right. It tends to do its own thing, more or less. And that characteristic makes it really valuable for building a balanced portfolio. It can help stabilize things, potentially reduce overall risk, and maybe even boost returns because it adds that element that behaves differently from everything else. A true diversifier.
Protection, convenience, diversification.
Yeah.
Those are definitely strong arguments, especially for maybe older investors or big institutions, which again makes you wonder why the delay in Korea. What's the holdup?
Well, according to the panel, a lot of it boils down to this lingering conservative stance from the authorities. It's kind of a hangover from that period back in 2017, the whole speculative frenzy around crypto.
Ah, right. That really spooked the regulators.
It did. And it seems to have created this lasting caution within the regulatory bodies.
Yeah.
They tend to approach new digital asset products very carefully, often wanting crystal clear legislative backing before they'll approve anything.
So it's a legal issue, too.
Yeah, there's a legal hurdle. The Capital Markets Act here in Korea, it's apparently a bit ambiguous about whether digital assets like Bitcoin can even legally be the underlying asset for an ETF.
Huh. So the law needs to catch up.
Pretty much. To allow Bitcoin ETFs, you'd need one of two things. Either the authorities would have to make a forward-looking interpretation of the existing law, basically saying, yes, this fits, which they've been hesitant to do because of that cautious stance.
Right.
Or the law itself, the Capital Markets Act, would need to be amended, explicitly allowing it. But like we said before, with the new government's pledges and just seeing what's happening globally, there's renewed hope that these discussions, which are apparently already happening more constructively between regulators and the industry, will lead to faster action.
Okay, so if or maybe when Bitcoin ETFs finally get the green light in Korea, what kind of impact are we talking about? Is it just another investment option, or could it be like truly transformative for the crypto market here? Could it bring in money that just wasn't able to get in before?
The feeling on the panel was definitely leaning towards transformative event. The big reason is that launching ETFs would significantly open the door for institutional capital.
Right, the big players.
Exactly. A lot of institutions, think pension funds, big asset managers, they often have really strict rules or regulations that stop them from holding volatile things like Bitcoin directly on their books.
Too risky or just not allowed by their mandate?
Right. But these same institutions can usually hold ETFs. ETFs fit neatly into their existing frameworks, just like stocks or bonds. So making Bitcoin accessible via an ETF structure means all that institutional money, which is currently sitting on the sidelines, could potentially start flowing into the Korean Bitcoin market. That could lead to really substantial growth, not just from retail folks, but from these deep-pocketed players.
And potentially companies putting it on their balance sheets, too.
Yeah, there was even some hope expressed about that, maybe later this year. If companies start adding Bitcoin to their corporate treasuries, that's another huge step towards mainstream acceptance and market expansion.
That would be a major shift. But, okay, this brings up a practical point. Are Korean asset management firms actually ready for this? The moderator apparently raised some concerns, right, about things like hedging tools or maybe just lack of experience.
Yeah, the moderator did bring up some valid points, and the panelists acknowledged them. For example, Korea doesn't have Bitcoin futures ETFs yet. That means asset managers don't have an easy, regulated way to short Bitcoin to hedge against price drops, which is a standard risk management tool in other markets.
Okay, so a missing piece of the puzzle.
A bit, yeah. And it's true that domestic firms don't have, years and years of direct experience managing virtual asset products specifically. However, the counterpoint was strong. Many of the big domestic ETF operators are already actively preparing. The chairman mentioned that leading financial firms are deep into planning their Bitcoin ETF strategies. They see the writing on the wall, the potential, and they're getting ready.
So they're not starting from scratch when the approval comes.
Not at all. And it was also stressed that launching these isn't just about the asset manager. You need a whole ecosystem of partners working together.
Like who?
Like prime brokers,
Right.
the firms that handle lending and holding assets for big institutional clients, and very importantly, custodians. You need secure, trusted entities like Kim Seo-jun's company, Hashed, for example, to actually hold and safeguard the underlying Bitcoin. That's absolutely critical for investor trust.
Right, you need the whole infrastructure.
Exactly. So the overall feeling was, look, with the right policy support and good cooperation between all these players, the asset managers, the securities firms, the exchanges, the prime brokers, the custodians, Korean firms are definitely capable of listing and managing these ETFs successfully. They can leverage their existing financial expertise and infrastructure.
Okay, that makes sense. Now here's something really interesting. Assuming they can launch them, what makes a Korean Bitcoin ETF potentially better or different than just buying, say, a US-listed one? Are there unique advantages for a Korean investor choosing a domestic product? Could Korea even innovate here?
That's a great question. And yeah, the panel highlighted several really compelling potential advantages for domestic ETFs. First, just basic convenience and accessibility. Think about taxes. Reporting gains from a domestic ETF would likely be way simpler for Korean investors compared to figuring out U.S. tax forms and regulations for a foreign ETF. That's a big headache removed.
Oh yeah, taxes are always a pain.
Definitely. And also trading hours. A Korean ETF trades during Korean market hours, making it much easier to react to news or price movements compared to a U.S. ETF trading overnight.
Good point. That else.
Second, information and education. Domestic firms are obviously much better positioned to provide high-quality educational materials, market analysis, and support in Korean, tailored specifically to the local market's needs and understanding. That can really help with broader adoption and investor confidence.
Better local support. Makes sense.
Third, dispute resolution. If something goes wrong, dealing with issues through the familiar Korean regulatory system is likely going to feel much easier and more stable for a local investor than trying to resolve a dispute with a foreign entity under foreign laws.
Right, closer to home.
Fourth, and this is quite specific, FX hedging options. Domestic ETFs could offer versions that are hedged against currency fluctuations between the Korean won and the US dollar alongside unhedged versions.
So you can choose whether to take on the currency risk or not.
Exactly. That gives investors flexibility that most foreign ETFs wouldn't offer, addressing a key concern for international investing.
Okay, those are strong practical points. Any others?
Yes, and this one is maybe the most exciting. Creativity and flexibility. The idea here is that the Korean market, perhaps being a bit nimbler or more tech-focused than the giant U.S. market, might allow for more innovative product structures.
Like what kind of innovation?
Well, they threw out some possibilities. Maybe ETFs that blend Bitcoin with Ether, for instance, or even hybrid products combining Bitcoin with traditional assets like stocks or bonds within a single ETF wrapper.
Interesting portfolio mixes.
Yeah. And they even mentioned the potential for things like Bitcoin-covered call ETFs. For listeners, that basically means the ETF holds Bitcoin and sells call options against it to generate income. It's a strategy to potentially earn more stable, regular dividend-like payments, even if Bitcoin's price is volatile.
So yield generation from Bitcoin.
Potentially, yes. The point is, Korean operators might not just copy the U.S. models, but could actually develop a more diverse, maybe more attractive range of crypto ETF products tailored specifically for Korean investors' needs and risk appetites. They could potentially leapfrog a bit.
That's fascinating, the idea of Korea not just catching up, but maybe even leading with product innovation. Okay, we've gone deep on Bitcoin ETFs, but you mentioned the panel also looked even further ahead, right, into the broader future of financial innovation. What was the next big thing they touched on?
Yeah, they definitely painted a picture beyond just ETFs. The next major frontier they highlighted was tokenized securities, often called security token offerings, or STOs.
Tokenized securities, so like digitizing traditional assets.
Exactly. The panel saw it as the natural next step after we move from paper stock certificates to electronic records. The next evolution is issuing ownership of assets directly as tokens on a blockchain. And the key is, this isn't just for stocks or bonds. A token can represent ownership in almost anything.
Like what?
Real estate, art, intellectual property, even a share of future revenues from a project. The vision is a future where potentially all sorts of assets, maybe even entire real estate funds, are issued as tokens. This could allow for things like fractional ownership, buying just a small piece of an expensive asset, and make currently illiquid assets much easier to trade.
Okay, making more things investable and tradable.
Right. But the really powerful idea they discussed was the ability to embed extra features or rights directly into the token itself. It's not just about ownership, it's about adding value-added services or specific privileges.
You mentioned a baseball stadium analogy earlier. How does that illustrate this added value?
Yeah, that was a great example they used. Imagine they're rebuilding a baseball stadium and they fund part of it by selling stadium tokens. Now, as a token holder, you wouldn't just get a potential financial return, like a share of ticket sales or concessions revenue.
Okay, like a normal investment.
Right. But with tokenization, they could program extra benefits into the token. So maybe holding the token also gets you discounts on game tickets automatically. Or maybe preferential booking for using the stadium facilities, like the batting cages on off days. Or perhaps even voting rights on certain fan-related decisions.
Wow, so it blends investing with like membership perks.
Exactly. It shows how tokenization can create totally new ways to structure investments, combining financial returns with unique experiences or utilities that you just can't easily do with traditional shares or bonds. It makes the asset interactive.
That really opens up possibilities. Did they mention other areas ripe for this?
They briefly touched on the bond market, too, which is, enormous, but often quite inefficient.
How so?
Well, think about issuing and trading bonds now. It involves a lot of intermediaries, underwriters, brokers, clearinghouses, custodians, lots of manual steps, reconciliation processes. Settlement can take days. It's complex and costly.
Right, lots of friction.
Exactly. Tokenization could potentially streamline a massive amount of that. If bonds are issued as tokens on a blockchain, you could automate many processes, cut out some middlemen, potentially reducing fees, speed up settlement from days down to maybe seconds or minutes, and increase transparency because everyone's looking at the same shared immutable ledger of who owns what. It's a potential fundamental overhaul for a truly huge market.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, we've really dug into the insights from that Bitcoin Seoul 2025 session. We explored Korea's journey, the challenges and hopes around Bitcoin ETFs, and even this bigger vision of tokenized securities. For me, thinking back on it, the biggest thing that stands out is that potential for Korea. Despite the regulatory hurdles right now, there seems to be this underlying innovative drive and the actual operational capability to not just play catch-up, but maybe even lead with more creative financial products once the gates open. It's not just about copying the U.S., it's about potentially doing it better or differently.
Yeah, I agree with that. And connecting it maybe to the bigger theme, what really resonated with me was how clear the consensus seemed to be across both the traditional finance side and the Web3 side about the fundamental value of blockchain. Not just as, a technology for speculative assets, but as a core infrastructure upgrade for the entire financial system.
Right, seeing it as foundational plumbing almost.
Well, exactly. It feels like both perspectives see this as a really profound shift, moving way beyond just digital coins towards a future where almost any form of value could be represented and exchanged much more efficiently on these new rails.
Definitely food for thought. And just to end on a lighter note, they apparently made a Bitcoin price prediction during the panel for 2025.
They did. It was framed as a bit of fun, but the number thrown out there, described as cautious, was around 200,000 US dollars for Bitcoin by 2025.
Cautious. Okay, well, we'll see about that one.
We will indeed. But, whether Bitcoin hits 200K or not, I think this whole discussion really highlights that the future of finance isn't just about inventing new assets. It's more fundamentally about rethinking how value itself is created, how it's exchanged, how it's shared.
Yeah, it makes you think.
Oh,
What things in our own lives, what assets or even experiences could be completely transformed by this kind of tokenization approach? Definitely something to ponder long after you finish listening.